Hello, everyone, and welcome back to another episode here at the Damage Report. We've got a big old show for you. We're about to get into a ton of different topics, much of it having a sort of legal bent. And so we thought, you know what we should do? We should get an expert, actually. And so that's what we did. And so we're very lucky to be joined on the show. I believe is the first time as a co-host, Charles Coleman Jr. joins us right now. Charles, how's it going?
Hey John, how you doing? Thanks for having me. Yes, this is my first time as a co-host. Super excited. Looking forward to today's show and glad to be the expert that you guys found.
Awesome. So we have spoken previously on the show, and I know people probably are familiar with you as well from the Young Turks, but people who might not know you, tell us a little bit about your background and your experience.
So I am by trade an attorney. I was a prosecutor in Brooklyn, New York for several years where I worked in the gangs unit, investigations, a number of different trials for the city's most dangerous criminals, where after that I transitioned to the civil arena and I currently function as a civil rights attorney. That is my space. I do obviously a lot of legal commentary on outlets like the Young Turks. I also do a fair amount of diversity, inclusion, and race equity work for different businesses along with human resource solutions. So taking the conversation about disrupting systemic inequity on all sides and moving that forward in different arenas, that's my specialty.
Awesome. Well, I think we've got a good rundown for you, considering your specialty. We've got a few different things I'm really excited to learn from you on. And so we're gonna launch into that in just a minute. Before we do that though, thank you to everyone who is already watching, regardless of what platform you're on. Please hit the like button and share the stream if you haven't already, to make sure that we spread the progressive message. And as we go through this hour of news, if you have any questions, comments, concerns, or anything like that for either myself or Charles, you can send us comments, tweets, super chats, all of that, and we'll respond as we go. But with that said, why don't we launch into what's gonna be an absolutely packed hour. The trial of Derek Chauvin has entered its fourth day, and we have some updates from this morning for you. But I did want to just catch up a little bit on what was going on yesterday. We had a tense, emotional day, as you can expect much of this trial is going to be, with some witnesses breaking down on the stand and some new revelations coming in the form of new body camera footage. And so I want to start off with one of the witnesses, Charles McMillian. Here is a bit of what happened yesterday.
Mr. McMillian, do you need a minute?
Oh my God.
You okay?
Yeah.
I know that this is difficult. Can you just explain sort of what you're feeling in this moment?
I feel helpless.
It's just, I mean, it's difficult even to watch. I can't imagine what it must have been like to try to go through all of that. And so publicly, obviously a witness to the event, multiple witnesses have expressed that they believe that that George Floyd was in grave danger. And I mean, imagine feeling like you're watching that as it happens, and your mind is going back to other instances where the cops have done this and someone has died as a result. But you feel like there's nothing you can do. If you try to intervene, you could be beaten or possibly killed. You could certainly be held legally liable because the cops are going to be protected even in the process of doing something that might result in someone's death. So Charles, yeah, my heart really goes out to all of the people who have for a year been living with, I felt like what happened might end up happening, but there was nothing I could do about that. That's got to be devastating.
You know, John, there is a lot to unpack here from the micro level of what we saw with that individual witness all the way to the macro level, because you just said something that I thought was important. You said, my heart goes out to everyone who has been experiencing holding on to those feelings of helplessness for the past year. That's the entirety of Black America. Like on a macro level, that is the entirety of Black America that you just described, that has held on to that racial trauma that resulted from watching that, whether they were actually there in person or whether they were forced to watch that video because it popped up in their social media algorithms, or because it was just something that people were talking about. And so it's really important, beyond the X's and O's strategically of what we've seen from both sides of the attorneys, and we'll get into that in a moment. It's really important that our audience, particularly our audience that are non-Black, understand that that feeling of helplessness isn't just limited to that witness. It isn't just limited to Charles McMillan. It extends to all of us. It extends to the people on your jobs. It extends to the people in your communities, because that's something that we carry with us, right? If anything, one of the things that people should be coming to understand about this trial and what it's putting on display is that living in America without fear of the police is a privilege. And I want that to really sink in, because tax-paying citizens who have done nothing wrong, who have not committed any crime, when it comes to people who are sworn to protect and serve them, live in fear. And if they don't, that is a privilege. That is bearing really, really strong consideration when you talk about what's going on in this trial. And I think a lot of it was put on display on a macro level with respect to this particular witness. Now, as you drill down on a micro level, we have to think about where this gentleman is positioned. He's 61 years old, I believe, which means that he was born pretty much on the tail end of, where civil rights in the traditional sense, those gains were made in America. And so for him to be as deeply and as closely connected with something like that, and to then witness that some 60 years later is extremely traumatizing from a racial standpoint. So it's not surprising to me that he broke down. And the last thing that I'll say is, yes, we have been exposed to violence by police against people of color, against Black people, against American citizens for a number of different years now in a number of different instances. But this is different, and I'll explain why. When the police or someone is shot, when the police shoot someone, that's instantaneous. It happens very quickly, it's over, and you see it. This was nearly 10 minutes of excruciating visual racial trauma, where you had to watch it and you were there and you were present and you heard the sounds and you smelt the air and you saw the sights. And at the same time that these things happened, there was nothing you could do about that. And imagining that and framing it that way, and giving all those things contextually to the discussion, is why it paves the way to see what you saw happen on the witness stand. That is where that came from on all levels.
And it being drawn out just makes it feels like what Chauvin was doing. It's like there's so many more opportunities to not continue to do the awful thing that you're doing that you never should have been doing. I mean, I don't actually believe that the person who Trump, I don't know if you remember this, but Trump a few months ago said it was a really disturbing interview with Laura Ingraham where he said the cops who shoot someone is unarmed, they just choke, They're just in a high pressure situation, they choke. I don't believe that at all. I think that you pull the trigger in a second, but there's a lot of time of training and thinking about different groups and all of that ties into it. It's easy to sort of just look at the last second. There was a lot of time where we could have intervened, but this one, we're watching the video where someone could have intervened, or one of the cops should have intervened, or Chauvin should have come to his senses. And so it's somehow more devastating because it's drawn out.
I think that that comment actually, that line of thinking, that choke comment, he actually used that earlier than that. I want to say it was in 2016, after Terrence Crutcher, the gentleman in Oklahoma, in Tulsa, was shot on a road. There was a female officer, I cannot remember her name. He was by his car, he had his hands up. She was listening to, I believe it was her husband or someone else who was in a helicopter. And she shot, and he was on the campaign trail and he was asked about it. And he said, maybe she choked, or maybe, and you're absolutely right. I think that in an instance like this, it makes it even more devastating to understand that this was something that you could have approached in a number of different ways. You had backup, so your ability to sort of handle the situation differently was evident in terms of not necessarily taking that course of action. If there was a situation where for some reason Mr. Floyd was resisting to an extent that required you to take that amount of force in order to get the situation under control, we might be having a different discussion. I don't think we would, but we might be. However, you had the assistance of additional officers. Mr. Floyd, as we saw after a point, and even initially was not resisting to an extent that would require that level of force or action to be taken. So those conversations, quite frankly, in terms of someone choking or what have you, as far as I'm concerned, are non-factors. I think that when you start looking at, again, now the X's and O's, going back to the specifics of what we know now from the trial, we've seen body cam footage. We've seen the footage from inside the store before things happened. So now we have a much more complete picture of how these events unfolded. And with that, given that, there in my eyes, from a former prosecutor standpoint, from a civil rights attorney standpoint, and then from a common sense standpoint, is literally no excuse for Derek Chauvin to have handled that situation in the manner which he did. That level of force simply was not necessary. And now I think the defense is really grasping for straws, and it's going to be interesting from a legal standpoint to see how they continue to try and poke holes in the prosecution's case.
Yeah, well, you brought up the footage, so why don't we go to that? Yesterday, we did see some additional body camera footage in the Chauvin trial of Floyd initially being approached by the police. So let's take a look at that.
You see your hands.
Man,
stay in the car. Let me see your other hand.
I'm sorry.
Let me see your other hand.
Please,
both hands. Put your hands up right now. Let me see your other hand.
All right. What I do though? What do we do?
Put your hand up there. Put your hand up there. Jesus Christ. Keep your hands on the wheel. Keep your hands on the wheel. Step out and face away.
Please don't shoot me, Mr. Officer. Please don't shoot me, man.
Step out and face away.
Can you not shoot me, man?
I'm not shooting. Step out and face away.
Okay. Please.
Oh God, every bit of it, instantly he points the gun at him. Like he sees him and he thinks, this is a person that I should be terrified of. I should be terrified right now. And so everything else that happens has to be seen through that lens, that from the very beginning, he sees a terrified man and he thinks that person could kill me at any second. And so whatever I have to do to protect myself is probably justified. And it's Charles, it's so devastating to continually see the footage and know probably not gonna have any effect. Like even when you see the cops.
Right. So I think you hit the nail on the head, John, in terms of understanding where the conversation about this particular video starts. This officer had already drawn his weapon and was pointing at Mr. Floyd as though he were a suspect who posed an imminent lethal threat to him. In that moment, through those actions, what he had done was weaponize Mr. Floyd's blackness as a threat that justified him pulling his weapon. See, what people have to understand is standard police procedure is not to approach a vehicle with your gun drawn. That is not standard police procedure, despite what the Chauvin defense team is attempting to articulate and make us buy. The manner that this confrontation actually began was already in violation of standard police protocol. So once you started in that vein and going down that road, there's very little turning back, especially when it ends as badly as it did in the case of Mr. Floyd. So the fact that Chauvin believed that it was imperative for him to draw his weapon is already problematic. And then as you go through the footage, right? Like you've already articulated that this was someone who was clearly in fear. He wasn't resisting. He wasn't attempting to disrespect the officer, not follow his orders. He was actually in a panic. He was moving around. He was like, I'm sorry. He was extremely recalcitrant. And then after he was instructed repeatedly to put his hands on the steering wheel, it's exactly what he did.
Yeah.
So this story or this narrative that George Floyd was somehow non-compliant with the orders of the police is just simply, it's just not true. It's a falsehood. And now that we've seen the video, there's little debate in terms of how that looks, in terms of what that is going to mean. So from a strategic standpoint, from an X's and O's standpoint, what the prosecution is doing bit by bit by bit is that they are laying the ground, the seeds rather, and they're planting seeds to fertilize the ground in order to be able to connect those dots as the case winds up, as to why you cannot talk about this being police protocol, as to why you cannot say that, Derek Chauvin acted in fear of his life, right? Like you're taking away all these arguments, and that's strategically what's happening with how the prosecution is positioning it, which is what they're supposed to be doing.
Yeah, or I would say, as a complete non-expert, at the very least, he doesn't appear to be acting in any rational sense in fear of his life.
Right.
I don't doubt he's afraid. He grew up in America. He's been trained to be afraid of people who look like George Floyd his entire life. And as a cop, he's trained that, yeah, you should definitely be afraid. And anytime you're afraid, the most important thing is that you protect your life. And the biggest justification for lethal force is you just being afraid. And so when you combine that with an America that throughout Derek Chauvin's entire life, up to and including today and the future, has trained him to instinctively be afraid and suspicious and hateful towards people like George Floyd, that is a horrific equation. But the footage shows that while he might have been feeling that, there was no legitimate rational reason for it. It wouldn't be a justification for lethal violence even if it did exist, but it doesn't exist. There was no reason. He was being irrational to respond in the way that he was.
Yeah, one thing that I do want to point out that the prosecution, and I think those are all excellent points and things that, from the psychology of someone being in the space is going to be of very, very significant value to jurors as they think about the case and as they analyze, the mindset. Because a lot of what is going to determine whether Chauvin is convicted and what Chauvin is convicted of is going to be about mindset. There is very little question. While the defense has brought in this notion of drugs and other things being in Mr. Floyd's system, and there was some conversation yesterday, and there may be some today about drugs and where did they get the drugs and all of that, and how that may have impacted what was going on. There's very little question that Chauvin's actions contributed, if not were entirely responsible for George Floyd's death. So there's not a question of who did it. It's although the defense would like to bring that in, it's not likely going to be what phases the jury. What the jury is likely to wrestle most with is, what was the mindset? Did he have the requisite intent required in order for us to convict him of this crime versus this crime, of murder versus manslaughter? And so everything that you just mentioned is very important in terms of helping them to understand that and establish that. One thing that I do want to point out for viewers that's particularly important that people may have missed is the prosecution's witness lineup has been extremely diverse. And that's important because they are inadvertently putting on a cross section of what America looks like and what the community looks like. We've seen different genders, we've seen different age groups, generationally speaking, we've seen different races, and all of them have tied into this theme. And the reason that matters is you have a diverse jury. You have a jury that is, it seems to be very ethnically diverse. It seems to be generationally diverse. And because of that, you don't want to put on a witness lineup that is sort of a monolith, at least in terms of visually what you're seeing. You wouldn't want to put up a jury of, let's say, not a jury. You wouldn't want to put up a witness lineup of every black person in Minnesota who had a problem, because then at one point it might be easier for a juror to say, oh, well, what else are they gonna say? So on and so forth. Now you've put up an extremely diverse set of witnesses that really reflects what America looks like. So that also takes away an excuse for a potential juror to sort of blame what they are hearing or the position or the attitudes that they are hearing from different jurors on racial solidarity or anything of the like. So I think that's also a very skillful touch that the prosecution has engaged in around this trial.
I think that's a great point, important to bear in mind. Okay, so we are gonna take just 1 second to see what's going on with the audience before we move on to another topic. First of all, I wanted to thank both Jane and Ian for becoming tier 1 members on YouTube. Thank you so much for that, do appreciate that. You know, I have access to not only the badge, but the emojis as well, thank you. Let's see, Michelle sent in a super chat saying, I usually can tune in during the live show, but I just learned last night I'm getting my J&J shot tomorrow at 1:30. Hope everyone gets their shot soon. Michelle, congratulations. Glad that more and more people are getting access and that states are opening it up, even though if you're watching the pre-show, you know that multiple sort of heads of state CDCs and health departments are saying one of the reasons the states can open it up so early is because interest is already waning in the vaccine. So that's a dark reason for that to happen. Let's see. Amy says Terrence Crutcher was shot by Officer Betty Shelby. His sister, Dr. Tiffany Crutcher, is a prominent civil rights figure here in Tulsa now. Thank you, Amy, for those details. Okay, over on Twitch, wanted to thank Dragon Penny for gifting 5 tier 1 subs. Thank you so much for that. Leftover Zach gifted 1 as well. Snowflake Warrior and Brandy Lou gifted 5 as well. So thank you to all of you for being great ambassadors for the show and for the channel. There was a comment on Twitch from Hannah Baby who says, thank you for educating us, Charles. I've watched you many times on TYT and I always learn so much from you. The things you talk about can't always be easy to discuss, but you always speak with such grace.
Thanks, Hannah.
Very nice of you, Hannah. Tell me what to put says, this is why I love TYT and TDR. You never get the sort of analysis from corporate media. I love how insightful and eloquent Charles is in his analysis. We got to remember that this trial is a test for our nation. Well, tell me what to put. In theory, you could. Charles, I'm sure would be perfectly happy to go on any of those channels to talk about this.
But John, all jokes aside, this is exactly what we were talking about before the show. Is that one of the benefits of TYT as a platform is that it does allow for these more in-depth, more layered, contextual conversation around these issues that mainstream media kind of sort of wants to stick to the technical elements and the X's and O's, and there's nothing wrong with that. And I do think it's very important that audiences understand the process. But with a trial like this, right? Like as significant as it is, as monumental as it is in terms of our discourse and in terms of what it means for America, it's really, really critical that we engage these finer, more nuanced conversations and these more complex and sophisticated dialogues. Like that's a huge piece, piece.
I definitely agree. Well, and we're glad to have you. So with that said, why don't we turn to another topic, an important one. I was worried is not gonna be discussed nearly enough. Okay. Many states have been putting forward bills to try to restrict voting rights as a result of what we saw in the general election and the special election in Georgia. Georgia has already successfully passed one to try to make voting more difficult in a number of different ways, some transparently cruel and needless ways, which we'll get into. They say that they're doing this because they want to fight voter fraud and protect election integrity, or at least they usually say that. Sometimes they're a little bit more honest about why they're actually doing this. And we have an example of this with the governor of Georgia, Brian Kemp, in an interview with WABE radio, insisting that President Donald Trump's charges of voter fraud actually had nothing to do with their law. Quote, a lot of this bill is dealing with the mechanics of the election. It has nothing to do with potential fraud or not. So that's interesting for a couple different reasons. So it is dealing with the mechanics of elections, cutting back on mobile voting booths, on ballot drop-off boxes, literally stopping people from giving water to those waiting in line. So he is right, it's dealing with the mechanics of election, but they say they need to modify the mechanics of the elections because of fraud. So if they're not doing that, Charles, if he's admitting it's not about fraud, and this is a bill that's almost certainly gonna be challenged in court. Now you have the governor who signed it saying fraud wasn't the reason for it, then what was the reason? And does that make it a little bit easier to potentially try to get this taken out in court?
Two questions, very different answers, very different conversations. To your first question in terms of what was the reason, I'm going to be very curt about this and very straightforward. The reason is very simple. What we are talking about here is white nationalism. I'm not talking about white supremacy. I'm talking about white nationalism, and there's a difference, and I'll briefly break down what the difference is between the two. White supremacy is just what it sounds like. It is the notion that ethnically speaking, white people are superior to other ethnicities and other groups. That is not what is driving this conversation. White nationalism is the idea from a political science perspective, this is me putting my political science hat on, is the idea that America is a country that is founded by and for white people, and that the services, the government, the processes of what make up America are only for that group, that constituency to avail themselves of. And so this notion of democracy and people being able to participate in democracy in the eyes of a white nationalist is a falsehood, because that's not for you. And so when you ask the question of what is driving this law, what's the reason for it, the simple answer is white nationalism, because in effect, what they saw with respect to voter turnout, particularly in the state of Georgia during the 2020 election, was they saw that there was a group of folks who had a ton of access to the democratic process, who they had deemed were not supposed to have access. Folks were not supposed to have this much access, because from a numerical standpoint, it's very clear what happened. The demographics of the state of Georgia have been changing rapidly over the past 20 years. There's been a significant influx of people who have decided to migrate down there from the north and from other different parts of the country as the cities within Georgia have continued to develop. And so there's no question that the people were there. It was just a matter of being able to galvanize them in a way that allowed them access to participate in the democracy and the system and the democratic system that they hadn't before. And that's what Stacey Abrams and a whole bunch of other organizers on the ground in Georgia were able to do. And so in response to that, I think it was Kemp or another state legislator, it may have been another state legislator in Georgia, who actually had the gall to say, well, Democrats like to say that elections have consequences, and this is no exception to that rule. Elections do have consequences, and so
it's Kemp.
Yeah, Kemp said that, right? And so when I hear that, I'm like, oh, you're really clear. The consequence of everybody here participating in this election that we don't want to participate is that we're going to make sure that they can't participate in the future. And so when you ask what's driving this, it's absolutely white nationalism, and that's just very clear to see, because if it weren't, when you look at the increase in terms of voters and voter turnout, all of the statistics have not been tallied as of yet, but we are clear in order for Georgia to have turned blue, we're clear where the increase came from. We're clear in terms of what counties were responsible for creating that boost in Georgia. So because of that, it's like, well, you're mad because this group of folks were now participating in the process? What's democratic about that? As to your second question around the issue of whether this can be challenged in court, it really does require us to think about what, from a legal standpoint, in terms of presenting a legal argument around it. It really does require us to ask the question, if not voter fraud, what is the reason? If that's not the reason, if the reason is not voter fraud, and you said that it's not voter fraud, what is the reasons, number one, to change the mechanics in the ways that you have elected to change the mechanics? That's number one, right? Like, what is not being able to give someone water or snacks who's been in line for voting? What is that going to do to quell the notion of voter fraud? Right? Like, if we're not having a conversation about systemic disenfranchisement, then what exactly are we talking about if you're saying that the reason is not fraud? That's number one. Number two is, why now? This timing is dubious. It's at best specious, but if you take away the notion that this has nothing to do with fraud or the allegations that were levied by Donald Trump around the illegitimacy of this election and the results, then it really begs or raises the notion that they're going to have to come up with something from a legal perspective that justifies this being enacted. Now, the one thing that I'll say is, if that is the case, they have an uphill battle, because to my knowledge, we don't have widespread evidence of these things happening. We don't have widespread evidence of fraud being an issue where it would justify this sort of law. I think the challenge that is going to plague people who want to challenge this law is being able to make clear the ways in which this was specifically targeted from a racial standpoint. Because of course, as you look at the law, it's racially neutral, which is what it needs to be, at least on its face, to pass muster. I think that they're going to have to do a lot of research to be able to make the connection between, racial disparities that occurred in certain communities that will be disproportionately affected by this new legislation. But once they're able to do that, I think they have an absolute viable pathway to challenging the constitutionality of this legislation.
Yeah, they're clever enough in 2021 to make the actual bill racially neutral, but they also make it hinge on things that are not racially neutral. They look at baked in inequities and disparities and then manipulate those based on access to polls, ability to take time off to vote, the number of polls for the people there. So that's gonna help to determine the lines, access and how many people, what percentage of people have voting ID. They know, we have to do the research, I guess. They've done the research. They know that those things exist. So then they make their laws racially neutral, but rest on a foundation of baked in inequities. And your point about the timing is a perfect point. They passed this right after losing 2 special elections.
I mean, it's so obvious in as much as like you couldn't even wait to go change the rules. Like you lost, you were.
And why not wait? There's no other election right now. Wait 6 months.
I mean, just it only, in my opinion, puts on display how nefarious these notions are, because you were such a sore loser. You were so angry. You were so emotionally scarred that your red state of Georgia had turned blue, that like literally within weeks of your loss, you couldn't even finish licking your wounds. You had to decide, how do I change the rules to make it unfair for me and my folks to reclaim what we believe is ours? Again, this is white nationalism at play. And I think really quickly, John, one point that you made about, and it's important that the audience is educated, right? Because folks who watch TYT may be in debates with folks who watch Fox News, and like it's important that when folks have conversations, they're reasoned and they're informed. So a lot of people may not really understand what's the problem with voting ID. What's the problem with some of these restrictions that people are placing? And you made an allusion to systemic inequities that are baked into the system that make it more challenging for folks. And I think that it's really important that viewers understand, because of those systemic inequities, that makes it more challenging for folks in certain areas to be able to get ID. The types of IDs that are necessary may only be accessible in certain places. That if you don't have access to transportation, if you are unemployed and may not be able to afford that, or looking for work, or have a job where you can't afford to take off to go get an ID, all of those things are hassles, right? Like all of those things are impediments to participating in a democratic system, which our Constitution guarantees us as a fundamental right.
Yeah.
Right? Like, so it's not that it's supposed to be this challenging to participate in the system. And so when it is, your point about the fact that this reflects on the systemic inequities baked into the system and sort of uses those to take advantage of folks and put them in particular positions has to be understood in order to understand why those arguments about, well, this is racially neutral, everybody has to have an ID, everybody has to do these things, is because it does not impact every community the same, right? Exactly. And so I think that's what people need to understand as they're having those conversations and thinking about why this legislation is so problematic.
Exactly, and look, I'm watching the chat. I see some people who either honestly don't understand those inequities or just trolls. I don't know which. It's hard to tell if you're just casually watching the chat. But for instance, really fast, and we've got some other stuff I want to talk about. Saying you can use ID. Well, yeah, sure, everybody has ID. Okay, well then why in some states does your gun license count as an ID, but not like a student ID card? Why is that? Why are certain types of ID very carefully chosen that are clearly more likely to be possessed by conservatives the thing? Why is it that they fight back against Sunday voting when they know that certain communities are more likely to use organizing around churches to get people out to vote? Like, come on, like you can't pretend to not get that they're very specifically trying to target things that from a mile away view is racially neutral, but in practice is anything but.
I mean, the simple question is this. if you don't have instances of widespread fraud that are verifiable, right? Which we do not. If you cannot provide instances of widespread fraud that are verifiable, then why are you so intent on making it more difficult for people to vote?
Yep.
If there were instances like widespread where a particular method of voting had been taken advantage of, like I understand that there are instances where we have in terms of voter purging or purging rolls where we maybe had dead people vote or so on and so forth. I understand that those things have happened. And to that, I will say that no system is perfect and that there are always going to be people who seek to take advantage of the system, and you should never make it easier for people to ballot stuff or make the election not have the integrity that it should. There's no argument there, right? But the instances that we have seen are not having such a widespread effect that would require these sweeping levels of modifications and regulations from a legislative perspective, right? Yeah. If anything, these are adjustments that could be handled by your local elections commission to ensure that the integrity of elections were maintained. Nevertheless, if you don't have those things, why is it so important to make it so much more challenging for people to vote? You're fixing a problem that does not necessarily exist in the way that you are making it seem.
Yeah,
and I think the question there is, again, why? Let's look at who it affects. Let's look at who it impacts, and then you have your answer.
Exactly. And along the way, you have some splaining to do because some of the components of this bill are like needlessly cruel. So we're gonna turn now to a couple of examples of the media apparatus for the Republican Party attempting to defend the, in my view, indefensible. So when Georgia makes it not only more difficult to vote, but specifically targets things like people who hand out water to those waiting hours in the scalding sun to vote, making that illegal, it's hard to defend that. But Fox and Friends is going to try. Let's take a look.
The water argument is what cracks me up though, because what line have you ever stood in? If you go to Yankee Stadium and you stand in line to get a ticket, do they serve you water? Do you care?
Just hot towels, that's all I get.
I have been voting for over 40 years.
I've never had water.
And I have never thought to myself, okay, I'm gonna go vote today. Will they have snacks?
Right, absolutely.
I'm not worried about snacks.
I know.
No water.
Well, they certainly made it condescending, Charles. So the people who might have to wait 2 hours or 4 hours or 6 hours or 10 hours, as we have seen in multiple elections, and they're in that position by design. The polls have been taken out of areas to create long lines. Now, for people who are in incredibly hot conditions, they're just complaining because they want hot towels and they want snacks, Charles. What do you think?
I think that this is exactly the problem when you don't have proper contextual framing around narratives. I think that this is where media becomes dangerous. And I think that for as upsetting and condescending as this is very, very, very problematic and very troubling because people take these sort of half-baked narratives and they run with them. I live in New York. I've been to Shea Stadium, I've been to Yankee Stadium. Never have I waited in line in Shea Stadium to go into and get a ticket, as the anchor said, for hours. That hasn't happened, right? So by way of an analogy, that's just poor logic. Let's just start there. Like that's just a bad analogy to start with, to say, yeah, if I go to a baseball game, I don't get the water while I'm waiting. First of all, you don't wait hours to get into the stadium. And secondly, if you wanted water when you got inside, you could get water. It wouldn't be a problem.
There's probably people selling water nearby.
And there's probably people selling water. And let's be clear, because I live in New York, I can talk about this. If you're outside Shea Stadium or Yankee Stadium, best believe there are young people who are out there with the entrepreneurial spirit on, selling water out of coolers to people who are in line, or people who are just walking up because they know that it's hot. Right? Like, and that's not illegal. So terrible.
Can I throw in? You're 100% right, but I just want to throw in one additional thing because for all the reasons that you're laying out and will lay out, it's a bad argument, but it's also a bad argument for something that's not happening. doing all of this to say they expect water, they expect snacks is a bad argument to defend, like if the bill had taken away government funding for snacks and water. That's not what's happening here. They banned it. They made it illegal to give people water.
Or if the bill somehow mandated snacks and water be present.
Sure.
Yeah,
they never. Why aren't they making the case for why you should go to jail if you give someone a water bottle or a hot towel or snacks? They're not engaging with that very much, Charles.
I'm going to say something that people may find to be offensive, but it is what it is, John. These were 3 white people who were essentially laughing at the notion that Black people in the South, in rural places, who may have been caused to wait in line, were thirsty for water and couldn't get, and now they can't get it, and it's almost like boo-hoo, boo-hoo, boo-hoo. You have 3 white people who are on this panel, and this is a law that was passed in Georgia. We know that Georgia gets hot. From a cognitive place, it obviously evokes a lot of imagery that is reminiscent of civil rights, reminiscent of what we have seen for the struggle for equality on behalf of Black Americans. And for them to take such a cavalier approach to this is only demonstrative of their extreme level of privilege and aloofness.
Yeah.
And that's just, and that's just what it is, right? Like, I'm not, and these are one of these conversations that we have to be honest about the racial component that is involved here and the underpinnings of privilege that these people talk from with respect to their positioning in order to call a spade around what we're seeing in the media.
Sure. Now there's a slightly different angle on this. In addition to the bill in Georgia stopping people from being able to hand out water and all that, we know that most of the components will result in longer lines, making it harder to vote, making so some people will drop out or not even sign up in future elections to vote. Now, is that an issue? Seems like if you want people to vote, it'd be an issue, but right-wing pundit Ben Shapiro doesn't agree, and he has an interesting analogy to make.
Jim Crow explicitly created a separate system of law for Black Americans and treated them as inferior. There's nothing in the law like that. That's not only an overstatement, it's just an outright lie. But, says Jamel Hill, all of corporate America should resonate to the lie. The law imposes new voter identification requirements for absentee ballots. Well, clearly that's racist. I mean, you mean you have to show that you are who you say you are when you vote absentee? If you can explain to me how that's racist, I'm willing to hear it. Anyone? Bueller? It limits the use of ballot drop boxes. Oh, you mean like ballot drop boxes where people could just stuff the ballot box or take ballots out of the ballot box? It hands state officials more power over local elections. Even before the legislation passed, many voters of color in Georgia faced hours-long queues at the polls. By the way, voter suppression doesn't involve long lines. Any more than long lines at Disneyland are ride suppression. You know what voter suppression is? Voter suppression is where you don't get to vote. Making those waits even more arduous, the new law bans giving food and water to people in line to vote. That's not even true. It bans giving any gift to people in line when they are within 150 feet of the polling place. You can bring water with you. There are people outside who can give you water. This is just not true.
Okay, so he is lying there, but also really fast, Marissa, I have asked you in the past to not raise the pitch of his voice artificially. I think it's messed up that you continue to do that. It's making him look ridiculous. So if you could stop that. Anyway, Charles, so his analogy to ride suppression at Disneyland, we should take it seriously because in a lot of high profile write-ups and things like the New York Times. No, he's been referred to as an intellectual gladiator. So I'm probably too dumb to understand the analogy, but what do you think about it?
I think that Ben Shapiro probably knows a lot more about Disneyland than I do at my age. But given that, so I'm going to yield to him as the expert about Disneyland lines. But what I will say is that I think, he is doing what he is doing in order to feed that machine. His logic is obviously misplaced and does not follow on a number of levels. And it lacks context and balance. I mean, at the end of the day, we talked about the fact that if you look at the law in a complete vacuum, of course, there are a lot of provisions that seem to be fine. I don't know that Ben Shapiro has actually ever seen or used a ballot box in order to talk about people being able to take votes out of them. I don't think he really understands how those work. But even still, what he is saying again raises the question of why, right? Like, even if I accept all of the absurdities of what he's talking about, even if I give credence to every argument that he's made, my question is, why are you solving for a problem that you don't have evidence of existing? Like, you're going through extensive measures to address an issue that we do not have concrete evidence of having been a problem. And so the question there is why? Like, explain that, like explain why. And then if that's the case, why now, right? Like, did you just somehow think that all of a sudden we need to really shore up these potential security threats to our electoral process? Like, now is the first time you thought of that? Really? Right? Yep. So because of all of these things, I can't take Ben Shapiro seriously. And then with Marissa raising his voice and speeding him up so that he actually sounds like Mickey Mouse, there's no way I can take him seriously. Like, that's just not happening. So, yeah, I mean, you know.
Well, and
that's all I have to say on that one. So yeah, that's all I got, John. All I got on Ben Shapiro.
Now look, my last point on this is their audience, the Fox and Friends audience, the Ben Shapiro audience, are not like analyzing his analogy. They like the idea of black people not voting as much as Ben Shapiro and Brian Kemp do. They're down for all of this. I would just point out though, that if you are going to go up there and say, how dare those other people be bothered by long lines? I think we get to speculate about what the longest voting line is that they've ever waited in. Has Ben Shapiro ever waited longer than 32 minutes to vote? Kilmeade, Ainsley Earhart, have they ever waited 4 hours to vote? I don't think so. I never have. I voted in Connecticut, Texas, and California. I've never waited more than 30 minutes. And sometimes I just walk in and that's it.
I think, John, all jokes aside, we talk about context and what you are saying from a practical standpoint is exactly what we are talking about in terms of how context plays out and why it matters. For people who are not clear about what John and I are talking about, let's make some things clear. There are voting sites and voting places within the state of Georgia that disproportionately had fewer polling stations either open or available, or voting machines available for the amount of population that these areas had. And this was known. And this was understood, right? And so that is going to make the lines longer. You have a denser, more densely populated area, and yet you have fewer voting machines, or you have just as many voting machines as an area that literally has a fraction of that. So from a conceptual place, it's important to remember that you cannot compare your experience as a voter when you just walk into a space and you're able to vote and you're in and out within 20 minutes as to another area that has significantly fewer resources allocated to them in terms of voting machines and voting booths and things of that nature, but has a population that is like twice as much as where you live, or 3 times as much as where you live. That is where we're talking about. So the idea that, oh my gosh, they have to wait in line. There were people who I know in the state of Georgia, and I have family who lives in Georgia, who literally waited hours. Not 1 hour, not 2 hours, going on 3 hours to vote. A 30-second process, a minute and a half process, right? You get your ballot, you go in, you do your thing. This is a process that takes, 2 minutes if you have a sense of what you're doing and know what you're doing, but it's not an extensive process. And yet and still, there were people waiting in line for hours, right? Sure. Like, I think that's what people have to understand, that all voting sites are not created equal from a waiting standpoint. So it is indeed a function of privilege when people are laughing about the amount of time that people are waiting in line for stuff, because it matters and it makes a difference.
Yeah, especially when, as you pointed out, it's almost universally a bunch of conservative white people laughing about people in Georgia having to wait in line.
Exactly.
Okay, we're about to move on to very different matters, but before we do that, let's see what's going on in the audience. Let's see, George sent in a super chat saying Charles Coleman Jr. needs to be on here more often. Such class and intelligence.
Thank you, George.
Raja Harris says, I'ma just say it, Mr. Charles is giving me Dr. Manhattan vibes, but even better because of his beard. Yeah, I said it. That's a good character.
Yeah, thanks. Like, I appreciate it. Appreciate you.
Yeah. Mr. Elder Dragon, welcome to Tier 3 YouTube membership. Look forward in a couple of weeks to doing our monthly live Q&A with you. Steve Williamson sent in a very large super chat to say, can you tell me why they call it common sense when it's not common? You need more progressives in government. Yeah, that's always bothered me too. We do need more of it, but thank you so much for your support. I really do appreciate that. Melissa Potter said Charles should be a regular co-host. I agree, we might just see that. But he's probably gonna be.
Might just see that. Thank you, Melissa Potter.
We'll see. Yeah. Let's see. Jamie Blank says the longest lines at Disneyland sell drinks and snacks halfway through the line. That's a great point. We really should have mentioned that. They literally do sell drinks and snacks.
Again, John, I am not the expert on Disneyland and the lines. So
I've only been once, but
this is why Ben Shapiro is going to beat me in a debate on what happens in Mickey Mouse Land, because I don't know. Yeah. He does. He's the.
Which by the way, they sell drinks and snacks. They also specifically design the lines to be interesting, to keep your interest as you go. The Harry Potter thing that I did at Universal's got
right, like as you go to the park, right? It's a
and
whole
by
thing.
the way, Ben Shapiro, they literally sell speed passes that get you through the line fast. It's the worst analogy.
John, I think you need to challenge Ben Shapiro to a debate on, Disney World lines and the mechanics of those, the machinations of lines in public places. I think that should be
yeah. We're gonna do it on the Jungle Cruise, by the way.
or on It's a Small World, right?
Oh yeah. Oh God, yeah.
Do it there.
That was a trippy one. Okay. Musically Meg says, hi, my name is Ben Shapiro, and I inhaled a bunch of helium, so I need to hurry and get all these words out before my big boy voice returns. See, this is immature. I'll grant you that it's immature, but I'm gonna
Fox does it all the time.
They do. Okay, Raleigh Jones says, I'm white and I voted without a line in 20 minutes, got free Starbucks and croissant. I'm ashamed my race is doing this. Next vote, I'm driving to Georgia with a cooler. Well, be careful, because that might soon be illegal.
We don't want you arrested.
We don't want you arrested. Okay, we have a poem from Franklin Sharpslicer who says, one thing wouldn't make me sad when Fox is sued real bad. Another while I think I'm going to Georgia and give food and water. Solitary confinement for H2O or food. Bring it, I'm in the mood. Do well. Franklin, love your poems. Don't go to jail. Be very careful. And let's see, Bart says in the Twitch, oh, but Disneyland and Disney World would probably charge $8 for a bottle of water or $10 for a bag of chips. That is true. It is very expensive. Okay, thank you to Ellinger for resubscribing for the 10th month. Thank you for that. Philosophizer at 11 months. Snowflake Warrior at 4 months. Mad Crake at 4 as well. Thank you, Mad Crake Dragon, really appreciate that. Okay, with that, let's jump into, I think we can fit in 2 more topics if we're lucky, so we're certainly going to try. Wanted to give you a bit of an update on Pizzagate, the scandal rocking the nation right now, with Matt Gaetz apparently being investigated for possible sex trafficking. But there are a few new details today, including that while of course Matt Gaetz would lose his House seat if he was convicted of a felony, there are currently no rules addressing lawmakers under investigation. It's a very slapdash sort of thing that depends on whether the party leadership wants to act right, basically. So for instance, Kevin McCarthy says that he's gonna keep Gaetz on his committees, including the Judiciary Committee, which oversees the FBI and the DOJ, unless the allegations prove true. There's a bit of an issue there, which Ted Lieu pointed out, saying, dear GOP leader, you don't seem to get it. If it's true Representative Matt Gaetz engaged in sex trafficking, he needs to resign and be prosecuted. In the meantime, you can't have Gaetz sitting on the congressional committee that has oversight over the department that's investigating him. Now, in case you don't know the basics of the story though, he's been, apparently Gaetz has known for months that he was under federal investigation over accusations that he had a sexual relationship with a 17-year-old girl and paid her to travel with him. During that time, he's remained on both the House Armed Services Committee and on the Judiciary Committee. And by the way, we've learned now that the Justice Department has also been looking into whether Gaetz may have also been involved in relationships with other underage girls, as well as there are talks about investigations for a variety of different bits of corruption and things like that. Charles, in terms of what you've seen so far, and I understand there's a lot that we don't know about this, what do you think about what we've learned?
I think that for Gaetz to continue to sit on the Judiciary Committee as he's under investigation and he knows he's under investigation is the epitome of impropriety. I think that, what I will say is that while on its face, this story does not contain an outright racial element, I think that what we are looking at is white male privilege. And it's being preserved by the GOP because the reality is that were Gaetz a woman, were Gaetz a person of color, were Gaetz a black man, that there would be calls for him to not only resign from the GOP, but there's absolutely no way that they would be okay with him remaining on a committee that oversaw the governmental entities that was responsible for investigating him on criminal charges of this nature. Like it just wouldn't happen. Right. And so the idea that he would knowingly do this and sit on on that committee, it just demonstrates a level of unparalleled entitlement and privilege to this space. I think on a larger level, the GOP is continuing to fashion itself as a joke of a party. And this is where I hate to do sort of like partisan wrangling, but here's where I think that the GOP is continuing to paint itself into a corner in terms of who it wants to appeal to, who it wants to please, and what it wants to stand for. Because from a nonpartisan perspective, you have a member of your party who's currently under investigation for sex trafficking a 17-year-old girl, and you are sort of allowing this person to function with all rights and privileges thereof. And yet you are also positioning yourselves as the party of family values, the party of morality, the party of conservative values, right? And so just from a sheer eye test, it's like, this is absurd. Like, and as you continue to delve into it and peel back the layers of sophistication and complexity around it, you see that this just doesn't pass muster in terms of who you say you are and versus who you are. And so if you're okay as a party with this level of an integrity gap continuing to be a part of your daily, usual sort of MO, then understand that you're also making it readily apparent to the people who are on the outside who it is that you are courting and who it is that you're interested in maintaining and what you really stand for and what you're really about. And like, again, I hate to politicize something as terrible as human trafficking because I don't think that it's a political issue. I don't think that it's a partisan issue. I think it's an issue of humanity. But the GOP, in terms of sort of turning the other cheek and looking the other way, past Attorney General Barr was aware of this, like he was aware of the investigation, so much so that he sort of made it a point not to get too close to Gaetz when he was out with him in public. Like it's just really disgusting. Amazing. It's really disgusting. It's really amazing in the sense that you are putting yourself out as one thing, but there's absolutely no credibility to anything that you have.
Sure.
And that's been the case for the past 4 to 5 years, as we've seen. So the GOP has to continue to decide for itself, or maybe it already has decided, right? Maybe it's centrists, moderates, and leftists who have to actually understand that the decision has been made and it's been clear. This is where they are and this is where they're staying around what they're about and who they are, in terms of the soul of the Republican Party.
I think you're 100% right. I'm glad that you mentioned the Barr stuff. I want to keep reminding people over and over that although they're all pitching this as some sort of like deep state thing, like Barr was in on this from the very beginning. Now you can say that it's backstabbing or it's different Trump loyalists fighting each other, but it wasn't Joe Biden that started the investigation. It wasn't AOC that launched this. It was Bill Barr. And so people need to bear that in mind. But there is one other aspect of this that I do want to cover. We don't know if Matt Gaetz did what he's being investigated for. We don't know now if he's going to end up losing his seat or ending up in jail, but I do know one thing. He is going to continue to be humiliated, largely due to his own ridiculous handling of this situation. And right now, he is being thrown under the bus by so many Republicans. So this guy who's like a star on the right, seeing him debased in this way is kind of hilarious. Like as Charles was talking about earlier, Bill Barr wanted to make sure he wouldn't be seen near Matt Gaetz. Bill Barr, like one of the ultimate Trump loyalists. But there's also the component of what's gonna happen to Matt Gaetz after he leaves. We had talked about this earlier in the week, but For weeks, apparently, before news of the investigation broke, Matt Gaetz explored the possibility of a soft landing in right-wing media, reportedly including a potential job at Newsmax, and as the Daily Beast has learned, One America News Network and Fox News. Now, he apparently has said, this is Matt Gaetz, yes, I've had many conversations with many people about life after Congress. These conversations have been very general in nature and have never included me soliciting or receiving an offer of employment. There is not a single conservative television station I haven't had a passing conversation with about life after Congress. I have neither received nor solicited offers from any of them. But yes, I've talked to either executives, producers, or hosts at Newsmax, OA, and Fox Business, Real America's Voice. I've literally never even heard of that one. And probably others I'm forgetting in this moment as I focus intently on refuting false accusations against me. First of all, let's note that him talking about life after Congress, he's 38. He's not Dianne Feinstein. That sort of is telegraphing a bit of trouble ahead. But anyway, the funny thing is that while he's right, he has never, or at least he's saying, I've never solicited or received an offer of employment. We can effectively confirm the second half of that because these different companies have been jumping out to say that they have no interest in him being on there. A Fox News media spokesperson said, quote, no one with any level of authority has had conversations with Matt Gaetz or for any of our platforms, and we have no interest in hiring him, which is just, I don't even like Matt Gaetz, but that hurts. An OAN insider told the Daily Beast, probably not, when asked if Gaetz has a chance to be hired by the network. This is OAN. They're barely actually on TV. Multiple Newsmax insiders also echoed similar doubts that Gaetz has any future as a cable news host, with one source pointedly declaring, highly doubt it, highly. Oh God, this is Newsmax, it's OAN. They make their on-screen graphics in Microsoft Paint and they don't want Matt Gaetz. Like that's gotta hurt. That's gotta hurt. They're hiring like people straight out of like high school Republican groups and stuff, but they don't want Matt Gaetz. Charles, what do you think?
I think that Matt Gaetz on this front continues to, in his white male privilege, demonstrate a level of disillusion about his surrounding reality that is on one hand laughable, but on the other hand gives great insight. By way of some very, very loose, I will concede that these are loose analogies. In my head, I was just thinking about a few folks. I was thinking about William Jefferson, the former congressman out of New Orleans who went down in a slew of controversy. I was thinking about the former mayor of New Orleans, Ray Nagin, former mayor of New Orleans, who went down in a slew of controversy. I was thinking about Marion Barry, prior to him passing away, the former mayor, loved and cherished mayor of DC, who went down in a slew of controversy. And then I was thinking about Eliot Spitzer. And I was thinking about the fact that like after Eliot Spitzer had to resign as the governor of New York, he still was welcome on certain platforms and so on and so forth. And so now previously, if anyone didn't know, all the politicians and elected officials that I named before Eliot Spitzer were black men, and Eliot Spitzer is a white man. And by way of comparison, I don't think that a single one of those individuals, meaning Bill Jefferson, Ray Nagin, Marion Barry, or what have you, I don't think a single one of those individuals really considered that after politics, they would have an opportunity to do progressive media. I just don't think that that was something that would even cross their minds. But yet here we have Gaetz, who's currently under investigation, right? And he really feels like, well, why wouldn't I be able to do TV? Like those are the vibes that we're getting. And so you have to ask yourself, even as they are delusional, what gives you that level of entitlement? Like proverbially speaking, and I know that this is a daytime program, so I'm gonna try to say this as politely as I can. The balls on this guy. Like what would make you think that like that is your next step and option? That you would be able to make that move. As laughable as it is, it's alarming.
Are you familiar with Joseph Ganim?
No, who's that?
So I'm from Bridgeport, Connecticut originally, and we had a mayor, Joseph Ganim. Joseph Ganim, like a lot of politicians in Bridgeport historically, was corrupt, and he accepted money in exchange for blah 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 or whatever. And he was caught actually. He went to federal prison for years, and then, as you were saying, he had the balls to run for mayor again. And the joke was on us because he won.
Yeah,
he was reelected after federal prison.
Wow,
this is my hometown.
Wow.
He's white, by the way.
Shout out to Bridgeport. Shout out to Bridgeport.
Oh my God. Anyway, maybe he'll get a position. I don't know. Not there. Maybe he'll work for like Steven Crowder on YouTube or something. I don't know.
Nah, when Trump opens up his network, he'll get a job there.
That's true. That's true. He's a loyalist. Okay, really fast. I wanna just tee this up because I definitely want your thoughts on this. Very important topics. New York City has been making some big moves recently and changing the legality of a number of different things. The first that I want to talk about is qualified immunity because New York, the city council has now voted to be the first state to end qualified immunity for the New York Police Department officers. It's not only the first, it would be targeting the largest police force in the US with some 36,000 officers. And so qualified immunity, which I think has been talked about a lot more in the last year or so popularly than in years past. That's a pretty big change. Although, as Mayor Bill de Blasio points out, it makes it easier if someone has a concern to bring a legal action, but it does not put the individual financial penalty on the officer. It puts on the department and the city. And that's what I was comfortable with, he says. So they still sort of have a version of protection. But Charles, what do you think about this change in New York? It seems pretty big.
I am proud to be a New Yorker because of this. I have been beating the drum around qualified immunity being a non-negotiable for Black people in America for a while now. I won't say how long, but as a former prosecutor, I can tell you that what I will say is that there's no culture in police and law enforcement without accountability. And now that we can have all the conversation that we want about the toxic nature of America's police force, but until we create some actual accountability within the culture, and this is what removing the barrier of qualified immunity does, we won't see things change. There's something very important about this that I want to point out to viewers though. As we look at the evolution of revamping criminal justice in America and what that looks like systemically. From a political standpoint, these things are going to be really, really interesting because I suspect that New York is the first of what will be many cities that begin to remove qualified immunity. And then when you factor into the equation things like what my good friend Marilyn Mosby, State Attorney General in Maryland and Baltimore is doing out there, and experiments like that, right? Across the country, by and large, the top 10 cities that have the highest populations of Black people in America are democratically run. So what does that mean? It means that if we are looking at conditions that disproportionately affect Black people in certain communities, and these communities are all democratically run, from a partisan politics standpoint, number one, it opens the door for an opportunity that the GOP is missing terribly. And number two, it's putting Democrats on notice that the more people start looking around and paying attention, they're gonna have to shape up or ship out. Yeah. And it's going to set up a showdown between police unions, police, citizens, community, and crime. Now there's this sort of intersectional nexus of all of these different factors that we are going to see how this removal of qualified immunity plays out, because I can trust and you can trust and believe that police and police unions are mad as hell right now. And you're gonna have to see what that plays out in terms of work slowdowns. Is crime gonna go up?
Yeah.
The experiment in Baltimore suggests that it won't, right? Like, how's that going to affect the relationship between police and prosecutors? So there's a lot now that this sets the stage for, and I think that voters and viewers need to sort of really be paying attention within the weeds of how this plays out from a nuanced place in the political sphere, because it's going to have an impact.
Exactly. Yeah, no, that is fascinating. I do want to clarify one thing. I think I said first state to do this. It's the city. It's the first city to do this. So I apologize if I briefly misinformed anyone about that. So that is a big distinction. But as we pointed out, the NYPD is massive. So if it's going to be one city, that's a pretty big city for it to affect. I'm Chicago and LA basically, or we'll see what happens. But anyway, Charles, That was awesome. Thank you so much. I've been watching throughout, and the reaction in the audience to you has been absolutely amazing. I can't imagine anyone I would have rather had breaking down this particular list of topics. So thank you so much. Had a lot of fun.
Thank you, John. I really enjoyed it. Thanks for having me. Shout out to everybody who tuned in. I hope to be back. Please, keep me in mind, and hopefully we can do this again. As Diddy said, we can do this every weekend. Awesome. That's a line from a Biggie Small song. But yeah, let's make this a regular thing. I love it.
Awesome. Sounds good. Talk to you soon. Have a good day.
All right, John. Take care.
And for those of you in the audience, I want to read some of your comments and super chats. We have a few minutes remaining. Let's see. Steve Williamson with another big super chat. Thank you so much for the support, Steve Williamson, saying you should make your voting laws the same as ours in Nova Scotia. We could almost stick a pin anywhere in the map and find voting laws that are more encouraging of democratic participation in voting. Canada would be a great place to start. Thank you for both the suggestion and the support. Another Skywalker with a big super chat saying, I'm a former police officer. I don't even know why there is a debate. The ridiculous arguments made on Chauvin's behalf only further sow mistrust of the police, makes our jobs harder and less safe. Chauvin had callous disregard for Floyd's life and murdered him. That is a very reasonable former police officer there. Thank you, another Skywalker. A lot of the arguments, of course, in situations like this are not fundamentally about what he did if it was reasonable. It's all about other stuff, about views on race, views on the relationship between the police and communities. They're not really arguing the merits here because the merits are unarguable. Jane, you can't make me dragon says the year Trump was elected in AZ, there were so few voting locations, people ordered pizza twice, talking 12 plus hours waiting during the primaries, temps over 100 degrees. Help us if this kind of legislation passes here. Exactly. Ben Shapiro has never waited 8 hours in line. He would not wait 8 hours in line. He wouldn't wait 8 hours to go through that really psychedelic poo ride at Disneyland. You just wouldn't do it. He says voter suppression is about making you not vote, not just inconveniencing you. Here's the thing. First of all, inconveniencing you and your voting is bad and we should fight it. But the point is to try to get people not to vote. You're hoping that they will drop out of the line or that the experience will so scar them that they won't vote in future elections. He's being not just his normal sort of dense, he's being purposefully dense here. That intellectual gladiator. Steve Williamson said, hey Steve, again, says, our voting laws are simple. Everyone in Nova Scotia over 18 receives a card. No, it's a great idea. There should be automatic voter registration. There could easily be automatic voter registration. Steve, it's just they don't want it to exist, but thank you. Rachel Rhodes says it's BS. We lost Al Franken, but can't shake Matt. I'm a Tool Gates. Yeah, there's always a lot of hypocrisy in terms of, it was like I said, it's about whether the party wants to act right. Forrest Dudley says, hey, Dragon Daddy, glad I'm able to catch you guys even if I'm late. Just wanted to say that Matt Gaetz has shown himself to be the worst kind of tool possible, a single bladed garden implement that I can't type out here. I think I know what you're hinting at there. Anyway, Lawrence Wells says, hi, John, and welcome to Dragon Squad. Charles, it's good to have you on today. Remember to pick your dragon name on your way out, and I hope to see you here again soon. We have a lot of new hosts on every once in a while. I'm trying not to scare them with too much. We'll have him back on. We'll figure out a name. Don't worry. Okay, let's see. Trimo Batiki over on Twitch says Charles needs a dragon name. What did you just? Don't breathe fire just yet. We'll get to it. Blue Lizard Gut says on Twitch, I am from Orange County, California, which is extremely white, and yes, it is. And over there, I never waited at all, just walked in. I now live in a black neighborhood in Brooklyn. The lines here are at least several hours long. No, but that's just random chance. That's not the result of anything. It's just a random chance. Okay, XX Young says a large portion of people in New York City don't have a license because public transportation is great here. That's a good point too. Yeah. Okay, Skylar Groton at hashtag TDR Live says, hey John, does a doctor have a dragon name? He will very soon. Don't even worry about that. Okay, anyway, that is all the time we have, but thank you so much. That was a big show, and it seems like you all enjoyed it. I hope so. We got to tackle quite a bit there. There was a lot more we didn't get to, but the D block we did. So all of you conspiracy theorists think I have something against it. It's not the case. Anyway, I'm about to go record an interview with the one, the only, thankfully, because two would be too much, Ken Klippenstein. We're gonna be talking about his recent exposés into Amazon. Oh my God, have they been leaking stuff to Ken Klippenstein? So that interview is gonna be coming out very soon. It's going to be fantastic, I can't wait. And of course, today's Thursday, which means tomorrow's Friday, usually. And that's when we take out the trash. So we're gonna be picking our garbage people of the week. You can participate by going to the community tab on YouTube and voting. You might have to scroll down a little bit, but you can vote for who you think is the biggest piece of garbage. I actually have a hint about who mine might be based on something I saw right before the show. And while you're on that community tab, I want to remind you of one thing. Did you know we have YouTube membership now? You probably do because I talk about it a lot, but just in case you don't, you can become a YouTube member very easily and support the work that we do here. All you need to do is click join, choose the level you want, and that's it. At the $5 level, you get access to the post game, watch videos on demand, get access to members only merch and discounts. You get a cool badge, you get access to all the emojis, which are really fun. It's the same price as a cup of coffee or tea at a place where coffee or tea costs $4.99. I've checked it, that would be the same. And let's see, you'd be continuing to help us report on corruption in politics, support progressive candidates, expose you to awesome new guests and co-hosts and all of that. We have other levels as well, and there's full information available. But have fun with that. And until next time, stay safe out there, stay sane out there, and we'll see you soon.